Okay, well, there was bad news from the government this week as Treasurer Wayne Swan announced the federal revenue would be $7.5 billion short of the last forecast. Now, that means the budget deficit will be even bigger than expected. Think tank the Grattan Institute said governments will need to cut spending and raise taxes to avoid the deficit spiralling out of control.
But is drastic action really the right thing to do? Especially, as many are asking, when big companies like Google, it has been revealed, are using loopholes to avoid billions in tax every year. To discuss, we're joined in Melbourne by the Grattan Institute's Executive Director, John Daly. Richard Dennis from the Australia Institute is in Canberra. And in Sydney, we have Federal Assistant Treasurer, David Bradbury. Good morning to all of you. Now, Assistant Treasurer, we'll be with you in just a second, but I wanted to start with John Daly, because your report is really at the centre of all this. You said that the governments of all stripes will need to impose big spending cuts and higher taxes simultaneously over the coming years. Does that mean that you believe that, structurally we have it wrong and that we're heading into the financial abyss?
Well, I think that's exactly right. We've had a decade in which Australian governments have had enormous tailwinds. The mining boom, the economic boom of the 2000s, the rapid run-up in house prices, all of these things have substantially increased government revenues. Going into the next decade, we can see a lot more in the way of headwinds. Some of those tailwinds unwind as we see minerals prices come off, and then we see a number of other things coming at Australian governments, particularly the growing rise in health costs. Australian governments are rapidly increasing how much they spend on health, and there's every sign that will continue, which is terrific, but somebody has to pay for it.
Yep.
Okay, Richard, if I can bring you in here, this argument for cuts and tax rises obviously is based on the premise that a deficit is a bad thing. Do you agree that a deficit is necessarily a bad thing?
Look, a deficit isn't a good or a bad thing. The issue is, given the circumstances, given where we're at in the cycle, and given what we're investing in as a society, is it appropriate? Now, anyone who's ever bought a house has gone into massive deficit that year. If your car broke down and you needed to repair it, and if you didn't repair your car, you'd lose your job. You'd be mad not to borrow a bit of money and get your car fixed so that you could keep your job. So I think we have a very simplistic public debate. I'm not suggesting this is what John's suggesting, but often what we hear is deficits are bad and surpluses are good. But never forget that a surplus means a government is collecting more tax than it's spending on services. So a surplus isn't an inherently good thing.
Mr. Bradbury, we will get to you in just a second. Can I just ask one more question to both Richard and John about this? You quite often hear people talking nowadays about winding back what is considered to be middle-class welfare, baby bonuses, first house buyers, premiums and whatnot. Do these things actually stimulate the economy, or are they becoming a drain?
Well, I think inevitably they do both, but it's also worth remembering that middle-class family welfare is just not that big anymore. The government has made a series of changes over the last couple of years. And yes, we still have a baby bonus, yes, we still have a school kids bonus, yes, we still have some parts of family tax benefit B, but collectively those things are probably not more than about $4 or $5 billion. That's doubtless savings that could be made, but when you're looking at very substantial deficits, that's not going to get you the whole way there.
Sure.
In fact, if you look at the really big blowout in welfare over the last decade, it's been in old age pensions. They've grown substantially faster than GDP, and the biggest source of that growth has been governments making decisions to increase eligibility and to increase the rate of the pension. It's got nothing to do with the ageing of the population. That still lies before us.
Okay. All right. John, would you agree with that basic sort of thesis on the welfare side of things?
Look, really, I think that the biggest and most rapidly rising cost to government is actually the tax concessions, the subsidies we give to very high income earners' superannuation. So we talk about middle class welfare, but actually last year the government spent more than $10 billion contributing to the superannuation of the wealthiest 5% of the population. So $10 billion a year, and the total cost of tax concessions for super are predicted to grow from 32 billion this year to 45 billion in 2015. So if we're going to rein in anything, it needs to be super.
Okay, David Bradbury, we haven't forgotten about you. I want to ask you this question. You have spoken a lot about how large companies are using loopholes to pay far less tax than they ought to be. Now, we've got a graphic here for everyone at home showing, for example, that on an estimated revenue of $1 billion in 2011, Google paid at most, I'll underline at most, $780,000. Now, that's a tax rate of 0.78%, and that's the most generous estimate, as I said. How big a problem is this?
Yeah. Well, it's not a bad tax rate if you can get it.
Yeah.
What we've been saying is that there's been a whole range of things happening across the global economy over recent years, but the reality is that our international tax rules were designed about 100 years ago for an industrial economy. We have a knowledge-based economy with technology, free trade, globalisation. What we are seeing is some of the largest, most profitable multinationals are shifting profits out of countries like Australia into low tax or no tax jurisdictions. That's why it's important that we update those international rules. That's an important thing that we're doing with G20 countries, and the Prime Minister and Deputy Prime Minister have been leading that. But even here in Australia, we've been beefing up our tax laws to make sure that these large companies are paying a fair share. Over the last couple of years, we've brought into the Parliament measures that will protect our revenue to the tune of about $10 billion. So there's still a lot more to be done. But it is true that some of the largest, most profitable companies in the world are taking advantage of some loopholes, and it's important that we do what we can to close them down.
Mr. Bradbury, I mean, I think everyone would agree with that. But those large multinational companies, foreign-owned companies, are very easy targets. You know, a lot of people are still asking why the government got gutless over the mining tax.
Yeah. Well, look, we certainly worked through the mining tax in coming up with a proposition that we were hoping was going to collect the sort of revenue that was necessary. Now, obviously, we came to agreement with a range of stakeholders to put that in place. That's something that we'll continue to monitor the receipts as they come in. But I think there is a bigger, more fundamental question that we have to tackle, and that is that some of the most profitable companies in the world, often they're not miners, are in fact paying some of the smallest tax bills. If that continues, then all of us, mums and dads, pensioners, people in our community are ultimately going to be the ones that are left to fit the bill.
Yeah, OK, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you very much, gentlemen. David Bradbury, Richard Dennis and John Daly, thank you very much for joining us this morning on Weekend Sunrise.
Terrific.